Okay, so this is definitely an argument, right? What's the conclusion?
He's saying that the theory is incorrect because there were living organisms in the petroleum.
Yeah, and the theory that is incorrect is what?
That the scientists are saying that the Earth's crust. Wait, hang on. Oh, okay. He's refuting the theory that petroleum was formed from deep carbon deposits, which are not living things.
Yep. So you it's basically we have petroleum, and we're wondering whether this stuff was carbon deposits or what?
Biomarker.
Say that again.
Biomarker.
Not or biomarkers.
Living organisms.
Fossilized remains of plants and animals, right? So, did it come from carbon deposits or fossilized remains? That's the debate. And these people think that it came from carbon deposits, and this person says, no, they're wrong, because in the petroleum, right, we have biomarkers, which indicate what? Here are biomarkers.
Indicate living organisms. Past
Past or present, right?
Past or present.
Okay, so past or present living organisms. If in the petroleum we have these biomarkers, which means that there are past or present living organisms, does that necessarily mean that the petroleum came from fossilized remains as opposed to carbon deposits?
Well, yeah, because aren't the scientists saying that the deep carbon deposits are not living?
The deep carbon deposits are not living. That's true. But if the biomarkers clearly indicate that the petroleum came from fossilized remains, then this could not be what type of question? What type of question is this?
Right now?
Yep.
A weekend?
It's a weekend question.
Yeah.
So if the biomarkers essentially proved that the petroleum came from fossilized remains and not from carbon deposits, then we couldn't weaken this argument. So there must be some problem with this argument. In other words, it must be true that just because there are biomarkers in the petroleum does not necessarily mean that the petroleum came from fossilized remains.
Okay.
Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the petroleum did come from carbon deposits. Would it still be possible for there to be biomarkers in it?
No.
Why not?
Because if they're carbon deposit, yeah, maybe.
Why?
Well, I guess I'm hung up on the fact, like, if the scientists are saying that there are deep carbon deposits
Yep.
that are in the petroleum, and those are not from living material, and if you also have biomarkers which indicate that there's living organisms,
Yep.
then the petroleum, theoretically, if you had both, would have living and non-living.
That's right. I mean, because the biomarkers are telling you there was or is now living things in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I guess my thought is just because there are living things in or were living things in the petroleum, that doesn't necessarily mean that the petroleum itself didn't come from carbon deposits.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what I mean, this is not good for the carbon deposit argument.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you got living things in there. But let's say that petroleum did come from carbon deposits. You have the carbon deposits. It turns into petroleum over time through pressure or whatever. I have no idea how that works. And then living things get into it. Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just because we have the indication of past or present living things does not necessarily mean that the petroleum came from fossilized remains. It still might have come from carbon deposits. Sound good?
Does it make sense to everyone else?
I think I thought about it as like there are two different views, right? So there's the petroleum from plants and animals, and then the petroleum from that they believe is from carbon deposits.
Mm-hmm.
And then it said their theory is refuted by the presence of biomarkers. So I said, okay, they're being the people who think it's carbon. So then
Yep.
it has to be something that would prove that it can be carbon. I mean, it can be living, but also carbon.
Yeah. I mean, this just comes
Does that
back to
make
the
sense?
the assumption that if you have biomarkers in it, it must not have come from carbon deposits.
Mm-hmm.
But you could have something come from carbon
And
deposits
still have living.
and still having living things
Okay,
in
I
it.
see.
The problem with all these arguments is that not that the evidence isn't supporting the conclusion, that certainly supports the conclusion to some extent. It suggests it came from fossilized remains, but it doesn't prove it. Right?
I looked at it slightly differently.
Okay.
So I looked at their reasoning. They're saying because there's biomarkers came from dinosaurs. Right?
Yep.
That's sort of their argument. So if you can find another reason why there would be biomarkers other than it coming from dinosaurs, then their argument is very weak. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're saying pretty much the same
you're
thing.
Confused more, but
No, I think what we're saying is the same thing, and that is that this premise does not prove that the petroleum came from fossilized remains. It's certainly possible that it did come from fossilized remains and therefore has biomarkers in it, but just because it has biomarkers in it does not necessarily rule out the possibility that it came from carbon deposits. Those living things could be there for other reasons. They don't have to be there just because the petroleum came from dinosaurs. Okay, so that actually gets us to answer choice D. Certain strains of bacteria thrive deep inside the Earth's crust. That could explain why there are biomarkers in petroleum, even though the petroleum did not come from fossilized plants and animals. Okay, so what were you debating?
I just honestly don't think I understood like the weakness in the argument. I don't think I like what you had just explained. I
Yeah.
don't think I could get there.
Yeah, it
with
felt like
this.
when we were initially talking about it, like you felt like the premise, in essence, proved the conclusion.
Yeah.
Like there was no, like, oh, there's biomarkers, end of story.
Yeah, I guess I just didn't push back on that at all.
So because it's a weakened question, it is something, like, it's not uncommon to read these arguments and be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then it says, which one will have true weakens the argument? You're like, uh-oh, that means there's a problem. Because if it proved it, then there would be no way to weaken it. So then you have to go back and just think. And the only premise here is that there are biomarkers in the petroleum. So this person must be thinking, that's enough. That's all we need to know to prove that it could not have been carbon deposits. So then we have to just start thinking, like, how could it still have been carbon deposits even though it has biomarkers?
I gotcha.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on this one while we're on it? Okay.